The first thing Mara noticed when she woke was that she couldn't remember falling asleep. That was the problem with the lucid, not the cold. She'd gotten used to the cold. The way the recycled air in the habitat module sat about 2 degrees lower than comfortable and never quite warmed no matter how many thermal layers you piled on. Not the hum either. That subsonic throb that lived somewhere between her back teeth and the base of her skull. The ship breathing around her in the dark. She'd made peace with the hum. What she couldn't make peace with was the gap. That soft, seamless rope between one moment and the next, lying down fully clothed with her boots still on, and then nothing, and then waking with the overhead strip lights, already cycling to their dim amber morning setting, and no memory of the hours between. She lay still and counted the rivets on the ceiling panel above her bunk. 42. She'd counted them every morning for however long this had been. The counting was hers. The aliens hadn't taken that. Mara. Devi's voice came from the lower bunk, slightly hoarse. You awake? No, me neither. There was a pause, and then the lower bunk creaked, and Devi's feet appeared at the edge of Mara's peripheral vision, and then her face, tilted sideways, hair matted from sleep that neither of them had chosen. She had dark half-moons under her eyes that hadn't been there. Mara tried to remember. Hadn't been there before the ship. Before the lucid. Devi was 29. And she looked 40 and she knew it, and there wasn't a thing either of them could do about it. Same dream, Devi asked. Mara didn't answer right away. She was still cataloging. The texture of the thing that lingered at the edge of recollection. More sensation than image. The impression of a hallway she'd walked down 1,000 times that did not exist on this ship. A door at the end of it. The smell of something green and alive, rain-wet earth. A sound she kept reaching for that dissolved the moment she focused on it. Same hallway, she said. You? The window, the one that looks out on the oak tree. Devi was quiet for a moment. I don't remember owning a house with an oak tree. Maybe you didn't. Devi looked at her with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite anger. Something sitting precisely between the two. Or maybe I did, and they took it. They had been told in the careful and pleasant phrasing of Dr. Sevolon that the memory irregularities were a known side effect of the integration process, that the neural bridge between human cognition and the ship's mapping systems required a calibration period during which certain associate pathways might become temporarily inaccessible. Temporarily. He had used that word with such precise gentleness that Mara had spent the next 3 hours lying in her bunk trying to remember her mother's face, and coming up with a warm, formless blur that used to be a face. That had been, she counted backwards through her waking logs, 41 days ago. 41 days of temporary. The habitat corridor was 12 meters long and 3 meters wide, and it was the only part of the lucid that the two of them were permitted to move through without escort. On one end was their shared bunk room. On the other end was the mapping chamber. The room they both hated, and both reported to every morning, because the alternative was something they'd been told. In the same gentle phrasing, they would prefer not to experience. In between was a commissary alcove with a meal dispenser, and a small table bolted to the wall, and a hygiene station and a viewport. The viewport was the only one in their section. They had fought silently and by mutual unspoken agreement about who got to use it, and for how long, until Devi had said one morning quietly, with her back to Mara and her forehead touching the thick glass. I think looking out makes it worse, and after that neither of them went near it anymore. The species that called themselves, in the approximation their translator chips rendered it, the Vathran, were not cruel in any way that mapped neatly onto human categories of cruelty. That was the thing Mara kept returning to. In the long, quiet hours between sleep she didn't choose, and work she hadn't volunteered for. T implies intent, implies a choice to cause harm, implies some awareness of the harm being caused. The Vathran were not cruel. They were thorough. They were systematic. They looked at a human nervous system the way an engineer looks at a particularly elegant piece of machinery, with genuine appreciation and a complete absence of moral consideration about what happened to the machinery while you took it apart to see how it worked. They had been since human almost 11 years before the first human knew they existed. This was the part that Mara found hardest to sit with. 11 years of harvested REM cycles, of scanned limbic architecture, of neural maps extracted from sleeping test subjects who woke in their own beds the next morning with a faint headache and sometimes a dream about a vast dark space they couldn't describe. She had been one of those people. She just hadn't known it. The Lucid, the name the Vathran had assigned to this ship, translated through their chips as an irony so thick it almost tasted like humor, was the next phase. If the first phase was passive extraction, quiet skimming from the surface, dreams scooped away like oil off water, the second phase was immersive, total neural integration. Subjects who were aware of the process, subjects who were isolated, controlled, kept in conditions of optimized psychological stress. The Vathran created pages and pages of documentation on exactly how much stress produced the richest, most structurally complex dream architecture. And the number was not zero, and monitored around the clock through sensors embedded in the walls and the floors and the mattresses they slept on. Mara knew all of this because of what she found on day 37. She had been in the mapping chamber, alone. Devi went in the morning, Mara in the afternoon. They had synchronized their schedules in a way that felt like the only territory they still controlled. Lying in the integration cradle, with the neural interface array fitted to her skull, doing what she'd learned to do, which was to let her mind go somewhere else while the Vathran did whatever they were doing. She'd been thinking about the hallway. The hallway with the door at the end of it. She'd been trying to follow it farther than she usually got before the session ended, and the images dissolved. She'd been almost at the door. She'd reached for the handle, and something had pushed back. Not Dr. Sevolan's smooth, translated voice over the intercom. Something from inside the integration itself. A resistance, a pressure, a sense of something that did not want her there. She'd felt it the way you feel a current in water, not pain, but force, directional and purposeful. And in the moment of that pressure, she'd had a thought, clear as anything she'd had in 40 days. That's not the machine. To the session, she'd sat in the commissary and eaten her protein ration and said nothing to Devi about it, and turned the thought over and over like a stone in her hand. That's not the machine. Something else. Something that lived in the integration. Something that had been in the dream space longer than she had. She told Devi that night. Devi had listened in complete silence, sitting cross-legged on her bunk, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. When Mara finished, Devi said, "How many other subjects do you think there are?" "I don't know. On this ship." "Other ships." Mara hadn't thought about other ships. The thought opened something cold in her stomach. "Don't know, but there are others." Devi said it flatly. "Not a question. There have to be." Devi nodded. She pulled the thread free and looked at it and let it fall. "Okay," she said. "So we're not alone." She said it in a tone that meant something. Tone of a woman filing a fact away, not for comfort but for use. That had been 4 days ago. Dr. Sev Olan arrived for the daily assessment, at the same time every morning, accompanied by 2 attendants whose function Mara had never been able to categorize. They were neither guards nor technicians. They stood slightly too still and slightly pull too much, and Mara had long since stopped trying to read their body language because the Vathran expressed almost nothing through posture that translated into anything a human instinct could parse. Sevolan himself was tall by his species standard, which put him at roughly Mara's shoulder height, with the characteristic Vathran bilateral symmetry that looked superficially humanoid, until you noticed the way his eyes tracked, each independently, like a chameleon's, taking in separate fields, and the subtle wrongness of the joint articulation in his fingers. Too many bends, too much range. He wore a garment that translated as a research classification marker, and he carried a device that recorded everything said in his presence. He asked her the assessment questions in the same order every day. She answered them in the order he expected. His expression, which was difficult to read, suggested a satisfaction with her compliance that she had spent the last 41 days carefully cultivating. Integration quality, he said. Self-assessed. Previous 7, Mara said. She'd been saying 7 for 2 weeks. She suspected the number he wanted was higher, but that reaching it too quickly would invite additional procedures, and additional procedures was a category she was in no hurry to explore. Effective state, stability index, stable, she said. She had no idea what the stability index was measuring, or how her answer corresponded to whatever the sensors recorded. But she'd learned to keep the answer consistent with how she physically felt, because on the days she'd said stable and felt otherwise, one of the attendants had made a notation. And notations led to things. Sevillon studied his recording device. "You reached a new integration depth in yesterday's session," he said. "Proximal threshold event. This is significant." Mara kept her face still. "I felt something." Yes, he seemed genuinely pleased, in the way a researcher is pleased when a specimen does exactly what the hypothesis predicted. "The emergent architecture in your dream constructs is beginning to interface with the deeper grid. This is the expected progression." He made a note. "Tomorrow's session will be extended, 4 hours instead of 2. After he left, Mara sat with her hands flat on the commissary table and breathed. 4 hours in the cradle. 4 hours in the integration. 4 hours in the part of herself that apparently had something else living in it, she thought. All right then. She had a plan. It was small and incomplete and built mostly on guesswork, but it was hers in a way that nothing else on this ship was hers, and she was going to follow it wherever it went. Devi had been an electrical systems engineer before the Lucid. This was a fact that Mara knew because Devi had told her, one of the first nights, in the way you tell someone something that might become important. Not for conversation, but for utility. She'd told Mara in return that she'd been in cognitive neuroscience research, which meant she understood how brain-computer interfaces worked in human contexts, which meant she had some framework, however inadequate, for what was being done to them. She hadn't said what she'd been sitting on for 30 days like an egg she wasn't sure would hatch, was that she'd been looking at the wall panel in the bunk room, and the wall panel had screws with a pattern she recognized, and if those screws came out, and if the panel came off, and if what was behind it was what she suspected. She told Devi about the 4-hour session. Devi was quiet for 5 seconds. Then, "I need 2 hours and something to work with." "I can give you 2 hours. And something to work with." Mara thought about the fork in the commissary cutlery drawer. The drawer they weren't supposed to have cutlery in, but did. Because whoever had provisioned the module had loaded it by the standard supply manifest, without cross-referencing the containment protocols. The fork with the tine she'd been slowly working loose from the base for 11 days. The tine that had come fully free this morning and was currently sitting in the lining of her left boot. "I have something," she said. Devi looked at her. Then she almost smiled. It was the first time Mara had seen Devi almost smile in 41 days, and it looked like someone turning a light on in an abandoned building. A little uncertain, a little amazed that the power still worked. The extended session began at 0700. The integration cradle was designed for physical immobility. A hard surface with recessed contours that fit the human body, with the precise unfriendliness of something designed for a species that had studied human anatomy academically rather than from the inside. The neural interface array fitted to the skull with 7 contact points and a broad-spectrum suppression field that, Mara had worked out, created the subjective sensation of the session being several times shorter than it actually was. This was presumably meant to minimize distress. What it also meant was that she had very limited ability to track elapsed time. From inside the integration she went in. She let herself go down the hallway. It was always the hallway first. 12-foot ceilings. Plaster walls, painted a color that was almost white. The floor a hardwood she could feel through her socks. This part she'd had to accept. The details were real, not invented. The supposed to prevent long-term memory access had a threshold, and her long-term memories were apparently stubborn enough to keep surfacing underneath it, distorted, but present. The plaster walls were real. She had lived somewhere with plaster walls. She had worn socks on a hardwood floor. She had walked this hallway before she was on this ship. She walked it now, the door at the end, her hand on the handle. Resistance, there, the same pressure as before. And this time she didn't pull back, she pushed. What was on the other side of the door was not a room. It was a space, vast and dark, and structured in ways that had nothing to do with architecture, organized according to a logic that was not human logic, and it was full of, she didn't have words, lights that were not lights, patterns that moved with intention, the sense of enormous depth in every direction, and distributed through that depth, something that was aware of her with the same quality of awareness that she'd felt in the initial pressure. Not hostile, not welcoming, simply present. She stood in the doorway because going further felt like a decision she couldn't take back, and she said, to the dark and the patterns and whatever was in them, "How many of us are there?" The response was not in words. It was in images, densely packed and rapid, a sequence that her brain processed before she could consciously analyze it. Faces, hundreds of them, sleeping faces, the particular slackness of faces that are asleep but not restful. Faces from a dozen different species she recognized, and a dozen she didn't, and at the back of the sequence, repeated, a shape she recognized as a ship, because she'd been on one long enough to learn the Vathran visual shorthand for vessels, and the shape repeated and repeated, 15 times 20, a fleet's worth of repetition, fleet's worth of cradles, a fleet's worth of sleeping minds being harvested. "I know," Mara said. "I know there are others. I need to know if any of them are fighting back." The pattern shifted. Somewhere in the shift was an answer she didn't fully understand, and couldn't have articulated if she'd had to. But she felt it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds form. Something that had been potential becoming actual. Something that had been waiting becoming ready. Not an affirmation, not a plan, a readiness. "Okay," she said. "Then you and I are going to figure something out." She was in the cradle for 4 hours and 12 minutes. When the interface array disengaged, and the suppression field dropped, and the overhead lights came back to amber, and one of the attendants came to help her sit up, she noted the attendant's hand, on her arm, the way the grip was firm enough to prevent a fall, but had no warmth in it. A grip that knew the biomechanical requirements of the task, without intuiting any of the rest. She felt hollowed out, and simultaneously more present than she had since boarding the Lucid. Like something had been emptied, but the thing that emptied it had left something in its place. She ate her protein ration. She did not say anything that wasn't ordinary. She performed the small theater of recovery that 4 hours in the integration apparently required. The deliberate movements, the careful sips, the blinking that was a little too slow. She performed it for the attendants and the sensors in the walls and for Dr. Sevolan, who arrived mid-ration to record her post-session observations. "Integration depth," he said. "Self-assessed." 9, Mara said, the number she gave him. Not the number she held in the part of herself she'd learned to keep outside the assessment, outside the sensors, outside everything they were measuring. That number didn't have a word. That number was something closer to, "I know where the edges of you are, and I know something that lives past the edges, and you don't." That evening, Devi showed her what was behind the wall panel. It was not what either of them had fully expected. And it was better. The Vathran built their ships with extraordinary redundancy. Every system backed by 2 others. Every line of power and signal routed in parallel through multiple pathways. And the redundancy logic that made the ship nearly impossible to disable was the same logic that meant a person who knew what she was looking at could find the secondary signal pathway for the neural interface grid. And, with a fork tine and about 90 minutes of patient work, introduce a specific type of interference into it. Not a disruption, not anything that would read on their diagnostics as sabotage. Something subtler. "It's like a stutter," Devi said. She had her hands in her lap, fingers still slightly trembling from the precision work, and she was looking at the wall panel. Replaced, screws reseated, the small scratches she'd made, covered with a paste of ration residue mixed with grime that wouldn't hold up to a close inspection, but would read as nothing on a visual sweep. The grid sends out a synchronization pulse every 90 seconds. Pulse is off by, she calculated in her head, 3 milliseconds, just 3. The integration depth read is thrown. The interface thinks it's getting cleaner signal when it's actually receiving interference. And what does that do to the dream architecture from their end? Devi's almost smile again. Makes it look richer, more complex, like the integration is progressing faster than it is. She paused. It also creates a feedback window, about 4 seconds every 90 seconds, where the suppression field is running on cached data instead of live input. Mara understood immediately. The memories, the ones they've been suppressing. Yes. 4 seconds is nothing in real time. In integration time, it's enough. Mara thought of the hallway, the hardwood floor, the plaster walls. The smell of rain-wet earth. 4 seconds, 90 seconds, 4 seconds, 90 seconds. A drip of herself coming back, repeatedly, patiently, the way water always wins against stone, if you're not in a hurry, and there's enough of it. It's enough to build on. There's something else, Devi said. She looked at Mara steadily. If the interference is introduced at a specific point in the synchronization cycle, if it's timed right, it doesn't just create a read discrepancy in this unit, propagates through the grid, like a signal that goes where the pulse goes. Mara stared at her. Fleet-wide, Devi said, tensionally. The silence between them lasted 4 or 5 seconds, which in the context of what Devi had just said felt very short. Mara thought about the faces in the pattern, the fleet worth of ships, the fleet worth of sleeping minds, the something in the dark behind the door that had said, not in words but in the way rain is a language if you know what weather means. Ready. How long do you need to set it up for propagation? Mara asked. One more session in the panel. 2 hours. Mara was already running the arithmetic in her head. Next message, day after tomorrow, 0700. Suppression field active from 0710. Devi behind the wall panel from 0715. 2 hours of work. Integration finished at 1100. Mara. Devi's voice was different. Theater. The voice she used when she was saying something she'd been sitting on a long time. If this works, if it actually propagates the way I think it will, we don't know what the others will do with it. No, we don't know if they're capable of. No, Mara said again. We don't. She thought about the pressure behind the door, the readiness in the pattern, something that had been waiting in the dark of the integration grid since before she got on this ship, maybe since before any human got on any ship, patient with the patience that made her own 41 days of careful, deliberate endurance feel like a warm-up. But I think they've been waiting for someone to hand them the thread. Devi looked at her for a long moment. You sound certain. I'm not certain of anything, Mara said. I've got 41 days of reasons to try. She slept that night without choosing to, and woke to the amber strip lights and the hum of the ship and her own heartbeat. And she lay still and counted the rivets. 2. Good. She thought about her mother's face, the warm blur that had replaced it, the plaster walls and the hardwood floor, and the smell of something alive and green at the edge of every session. She thought about the door and what was behind it. She thought about Devi's hands in her lap, still trembling, with precision, with effort, with the specific and human stubbornness of a person has decided that the walls are the problem and she is the solution, she thought. We are so bad at knowing when we're beaten. The next session ran long again. Mara went down into the integration and found the door and went through it, and spent 3 hours in conversation with something she didn't have a name for, in a language that was more sensation than symbol, working out the shape of a plan that neither of them could have built alone. The thing in the grid. She'd started thinking of it for no particular reason, as the chorus had been part of the integration architecture since the first Vathran ship. 11 years ago, a resonance effect the Vathran hadn't anticipated, and hadn't understood, and had eventually catalogued as an acceptable anomaly. The dreams didn't just feed data into the grid. The grid absorbed the dreams, and something happened to the grid. Something accreted, gradually, over years, and ships and thousands of sleeping minds. A mass of human cognitive architecture that had no business being alive, and was anyway. In the way that rivers are not alive but have intentions. In the way that fire is not alive but has hunger. The chorus had been waiting for a human who could reach it consciously. Mara was, as far as it could tell, the first. She hadn't been trying to be the first. She'd been trying to hold on to a hallway, and a door, and the smell of rain. Sometimes the most human thing you do is the thing you weren't trying to do at all. On the morning of day 45 at 0714, while Mara was in the cradle and Dr. Sevolan was reviewing his morning data, and the 2 attendants were standing in their careful stillness at the back of the mapping chamber, Devi removed the wall panel in the bunk room for the second time and worked for 2 hours and 4 minutes, with a fork tine and her own 2 hands. She was not an emotional person in the demonstrative sense. She did not narrate what she was doing or why. She worked the way she'd been trained to work. Methodically, precisely, the way someone works when they've accepted that the outcome may be completely outside their control. And the only thing they can control is the quality of the work itself. She made the modification. She replaced the panel. She sat down on her bunk and put her hands in her lap and waited. At 09:23, the synchronization pulse went out across the grid. Mara felt it from inside the integration, the way you feel a change in air pressure, sudden and total, and the sensation of something enormous moving. The chorus moved with it. 3 seconds of open, unmediated signal, flowing outward through the network at the speed. The Vathran had spent 11 years optimizing for exactly this kind of transmission, carrying with it something the Vathran had never put in it: data, not dream architecture, not the neurological signature of a compliant, isolated, carefully stressed human subject undergoing optimized integration. The feeling of a door being opened. The rest was not Mara's to witness. She came out of the integration at 1100, with the attendant's hand on her arm again, firm and warm-free. And she sat up carefully and ate her ration and performed her recovery and answered the assessment questions with sevens and stable, and was delivered back to the habitat corridor where Devi was sitting at the commissary table with her hands wrapped around a mug of the reconstituted tea that they'd agreed tasted like hot plastic, but was better than nothing. Devi looked up when she came in. "It went?" Mara asked. "It went," Devi said. They sat together at the table. Mara poured herself a mug. Outside the viewport, the one they'd stopped using, the stars were where they always were, which was everywhere. It took 7 hours for the first reports to reach the Lucid. Mara didn't hear them directly. She heard them in the way you hear a distant thunderstorm through walls, as a change in the texture of the ship. The attendants moved differently. There were sounds from beyond the habitat corridor that were not the usual sounds. Dr. Sev Olan did not arrive for the evening assessment. The commissary dispenser, which operated on a schedule they'd never been able to alter, dispensed their dinner rations 40 minutes late. 40 minutes, not very long as disruptions go. But the Vathran didn't run late. Whatever the chorus had done with the open door, it had done it in the way that only something built from 10,000 sleeping human minds could do it. Not through force, because it had no physical form and no weapons, but through the specific and irreversible effect of human consciousness on a system that had been designed to harvest it, without accounting for what human consciousness does when it has nothing to lose. It had touched every integration node on every ship in the fleet, and it had shown them something. Mara never knew exactly what. She suspected it was different for every mind that received it. Something personal. Something from the deep archive of suppressed memory that the suppression field hadn't fully reached. Something that made 41 days of isolation and erasure feel like a door that was, after all, going to open. The Vathran were thorough and systematic and genuinely excellent engineers. They had studied human neuroscience for 11 years. What they had not studied, because it could not be extracted from a sleeping from mind and converted to imagery and filed in a database, was what happens to a human being when you take everything from them except the thing they share with everyone who ever breathed and dreamed and held on. The Vathran had no framework for stubbornness as a structural force. They had no model for the specific damage done by hope when it has been surviving in the dark for long enough. They had miscalculated. In the weeks after, and there were weeks after, which was itself the answer to a question Mara had been too afraid to ask out loud. The accounting of what had happened across the fleet was slow and incomplete and sometimes contradictory. Chorus had no single coherent action to point to. It had not seized navigation control or vented compartments, or done any of the things a proper weapons system would do. What it had done, apparently, was introduce 3 milliseconds of interference into the synchronization grid on every ship simultaneously, and in the window that created, it had allowed the subjects in every cradle on every vessel to wake up, all at once, in possession of something the Vathran had been methodically removing for months. The specific, animal, unscientific, empirically unquantifiable knowledge of who they were and where they came from and what they'd lost. People who know what they've lost are different from people who only suspect it. Mara knew this. She had been both kinds. The accounting took weeks. The Vathran took longer to understand what had happened than any of their models predicted, because none of their models included the variable of something that accumulates in a system, not by being harvested, but because of it, something that grows in the dark on the specific fuel being taken from and does not stop growing until there is nothing left to take. They were genuinely surprised. Mara, when she eventually sat across from a Vathran communication specialist in a room that was not a habitat module and did not have a viewport she'd stopped using, found that she did not have the energy to explain. She simply noted, for the record, with the flat precision of someone who has had 45 days to rehearse the sentence. You should have accounted for what we dream about when you take everything else. The Vathran specialist recorded the observation with an expression she couldn't read. She suspected it would take them a long time to understand it. She suspected that was fine. On her first night in a room with a real window, Mara lay on her back and did not count the rivets, because there were no rivets. It was a ceiling, a real one, plaster, the color of almost white. Down the hall from her room there was a door. She didn't go to it that night. She just lay there knowing it was there, and knowing what was behind it. Not the chorus, not the integration dark, not the patterns and lights of something built from harvested dreams, but the ordinary rooms of an ordinary building. And outside the building, the green and growing world she'd smelled at the edge of every session for 41 days. In the morning, she went and opened it. It was raining. She stood in the doorway a while, with the smell of wet earth all around her, and the rain on her face, and did not move. Just breathed. Just let herself be what the Vathran had spent 11 years trying to make disappear, which was nothing more or less than a human being who had a past and knew it. Devi found her there eventually, standing in the open door. "You're getting wet," Devi said. "Yeah," Mara said. Devi stood next to her, and they both looked out at the rain and the green and the ordinary world that had been there the whole time, waiting, patient, in the way that only things which are not alive can be patient, which is completely and without needing anything back. After a while, Devi said quietly, "What was in there, behind the door in your dream? What was it really?" Mara thought about how to answer. She thought about the faces in the pattern, the fleet's worth of shapes, the readiness she'd felt in the dark. 3 mesolascetons that had gone everywhere at once, carrying something that wasn't data. "Use," she said. "Just us." The rain came down, neither of them moved.